we want to factor. And the first thing we need to think about is what is the greatest common factor? So what I'm going to look at first are the numbers. And looking at the numbers, I've got 15, 39, and 18. And I can see that 3 would divide into each of these evenly. So I'm going to place a 3 down as one of the greatest common factors. And then I'm going to look at the variables. And I see that there is an x to the 4th power, an x cubed, and an x squared. So I can see that I can factor out an x squared out of each of these factors. Now I'm going to actually pull that greatest common factor out of each of the terms by dividing 3x squared into each of them. So I'm going to do that next. So when I divide 3x squared into 15x to the 4th, I get 5x squared. And I know that's true because when I multiply 3 times 5, I get 15, and when I multiply x squared times x squared, I get x to the 4th. The same is true for the next term. 3 times negative 13 brings me back to the negative 39, and x squared times x brings me back to the x cubed. And in the last term, 3 times 6 is 18, and x squared times 1 is x squared. So now I have this trinomial here, this 5x squared minus 13x plus 6, and I can use trial and error, or I can use factoring by grouping. Now the book showed you a way of doing the factoring by grouping. I want to show you a new method. It's also factoring by grouping, but it's very powerful for students who are visual learners. And so we're going to call this the box method. The box method. And it's called the box method because we're actually going to use a box to help us factor that trinomial. So let me show you how to do that. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a box with 4 sections in it. In the first box, on the top left-hand corner, I'm going to place the first term in the trinomial. In the bottom right-hand corner, I'm going to put the last term from my trinomial. Outside of the box, I'm going to multiply this first term and this last term, and I want to find all of the possible combinations of factors that will lead me to this negative 13x when I add them together. Now I know because there's a plus sign in my last term is a positive 6, I know that both of the factors I'm looking for, one of the shortcuts that they told us about in the book, they're both going to be negative because this middle term is negative. So I'm looking for 2 factors of the 6 times the 5x squared that when I add them together will give me negative 13. So let's do that next. When I multiply the 5x squared times the 6, I get 30x squared. And so there are a number of factor pairs that will create this, but I only want to look at the negative ones because I know when I add them together I want a negative 13. So I'm not going to bother with the positive ones. So one factor pair would be a negative x, and I would have to multiply that by a negative 30x to get a positive 30x squared. But when I add these together, I get negative 31x. So this is too big. The negative 30x is too big. I need numbers that are going to be closer together. My next group of factor pairs, I'm going down in order. So I have a negative 1x. That's the same as negative x. So the next factor I can think of is a 2. So I'm going to put a negative 2x. And I know that I can multiply that by a negative 15x. But that gives me negative 17, and I'm looking for negative 13 as my middle term, so that doesn't work. My next choice is going to be a negative 3x, and that can get multiplied by a negative 10x. And I think I have found my combination here. Negative 3x times a negative 10x gives me positive 30x squared, and when they're added together, it gives me my middle term of a negative 13x. So now I can put these factors into my box in the two empty spaces. It doesn't matter which empty space you put it in, you just put them into either one. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to place the negative 3x in my bottom left, and the negative 10x I'm going to place in the top right. And now I'm going to use greatest common factors. Looking straight up, I'm looking at my 5x squared and my negative 3x, and I want to find the greatest common factor with these two terms in this first column. Well, there's no common factor between 5 and negative 3 except for a 1, so we're not going to use that. But we do have a common factor of an x, so I'm going to put an x above here. And then above the second column, I'm looking at my numbers and my variables, and I am going to put the number 2, because I know 2 goes into 10 and it goes into 6. But I also know that because of this negative sign in the center and this positive sign at the end, I know that both of my terms, my polynomials, are going to have to be subtraction. So I'm going to put a negative 2 here, because I can factor out a negative 2 out of both of these numbers. And now I'm going to come over to my rows. Going straight across the row, I can see that I can factor out a 5 and an x. And going straight across my bottom row, I can see that I can factor out a negative 3. Now, the greatest common factors that I pulled out of each column and that I pulled out of each row are the factors for this trinomial. So let's write that now as our factors. So the greatest common factor that we pulled out right at the beginning, I still need to have that in my equation. And then I'm going to change this 5x squared minus 13x plus 6 into x minus 2 times 5x minus 3. So the 3x squared is the initial greatest common factor that I pulled out. And then using the box method, the first term in the upper left corner, the last term in the bottom right, multiply them together, find your factor pairs until you find a factor pair that adds up to your middle term. Then take your greatest common factors in your columns and your greatest common factors in your rows. And what you end up with are the factors for the trinomial, the x minus 2 and the 5x minus 3. And you can always check using FOIL. First times first would give us the 5x squared. Outer times outer would give us a minus 3x. Inner times inner gives us the minus 10x. When we add the 3x and the 10x, the negative 3x and the negative 10x together, we get the negative 13x. And then last times last, negative 2 times negative 3 gives us our positive 6. So there's our check going backwards. So this is called the box method.